So turn the recording on and we will go from there.
Okay, thanks so much, Heather. Delighted to be invited to speak to you all, and yeah, hopefully you find it beneficial. Some of you may have heard some of this research previously, but it has evolved over the past few months. So I'll update you on that. So just in case you're not aware of who I am or where I'm coming from, I work in the National University of Ireland in Galway. You can see there on the west coast of Ireland, and we're part of the Rural Studies Centre at the university. And there's my colleagues on the bottom right with the president of the university. I completed my PhD in 2017, started in 2013. The title of it was Exploring the Human Dynamics Affecting Intergenerational Family Farm Transfer in Later Life. And it was all about a roadmap for future policy, and hopefully I'll explain kind of where it started and where it is currently sits through the presentation. And it was awarded a national award, so you know, it was pretty comprehensive and it was very well received here. So and just from visiting the US through my PhD and since, it's interesting that it's equally as applicable in a US setting as it is in Ireland and elsewhere in Europe. And I completed the Farm Transition Network training back in 2015. I was kindly invited by John Baker at the time, who you probably all know, and of course Joy as well, to participate in this. It was held in Madison, and that was during a time I spent in UC Davis in California. So yeah, that's my experience, and I have been on the board of directors for the Farm Transition Network since June 2021. I currently, my role is a postdoc researcher for almost 5 years now, working on this position in the university again. And yeah, it's really about engaging with policy, research and practice, I suppose, linking all the different elements. So yeah, it's quite a nice role, and I'm enjoying it. I suppose just wanted to get across as well that I'm a farmer. I suppose I wanted to point that out because of the positionality is what it's called in academia. And I found that throughout my research, particularly during my PhD, it really helped that I am farming background, generations, because you know, when you're talking about farming, in a lot of cases, there's a lot of you need to build up a certain amount of trust with the farmers for them to open up. And I think because I was one of them, I found it very enjoyable, actually, the research process. So yeah, I think yeah, if you're passionate about what you do and you know it's going to make an impact, research is quite enjoyable. So I just wanted to point that out. So yeah, so I suppose to set the scene for the research, agriculture, agri-food industry in Ireland is the largest indigenous industry. Huge value to our economy for a small country, 26 billion to the economy, 12% of Ireland's exports, 15% of national employment, and almost 140,000 family farms. Interestingly, it's interesting and informative, I suppose, to take note that 50% of these farm part-time, and a lot to do with the size of the farms. But part-time farming is extremely important in an Irish setting and elsewhere, I'm sure, because even though they're farming part-time, they stay in their community, and that contributes to the broader rural sustainability. Their children attend the schools, the local shops, so it keeps rural life alive. I want to focus on the dairy industry, a huge driving force here, I suppose. You know, exceeded 5 billion exports for the third year in a row. Yeah, just a few figures here, but it's interesting to show that our market is broken down by a third to the UK, a third to the EU, and the rest of the world about another third. Just to give a bit more specific on this, you know, for a small country like Ireland, we supply approximately 10% of the global infant milk formula. We're second now in the export of infant milk formula to China, and there's quite a lot of babies in China every year. So yeah, just kind of shows the scale of the output, the productivity from a small nation, and this probably shows the scale So there Ireland fits in. Yeah, you can just see the scale, and I suppose if we go into the history of Ireland and the politics of it, actually the top right north
yeah, that's what I got.
Of it is actually Northern Ireland. So the figures I'm quoting is actually without the north of Ireland. There's a lot of history to that, but anyways. So yeah, that's the population in comparison. So just you can kind of see the scale of what we're talking about and how productive we are and how important farming is to our nation. You know, I suppose when you look at it, we have a predominantly grass-based system, grazing season over 300 days a year. Animals grazed outdoors, and there's a lot of desire and market for that system, I suppose, in comparison to elsewhere in the world. That would be our selling point. And even our Board BIA, which is our food, agri-food marketing tool body, they talk about this, you know, the local roots, global reach. So it's kind of about selling that as well, but I suppose we have to do that as with everything else. But in the context of the research, hopefully I've set the scene as to what we're dealing with here and the potential of the industry. But there's an aging farming population, and this does raise concerns about the future competitiveness of Irish and EU agriculture. And, you know, when we talk about farming and even talking to students, even if they're not interested in farming, farming equates to food. Doesn't matter if you're a vegan or a vegetarian or carnivore, whatever, your food comes from a farmer. So, you know, that's the importance of this topic. You know, you only have to look at demographic trends. Close to a third of European farmers are above the normal retirement age of 65 and 34%. So it's nearly almost exactly the same in the US. And 5.6% of EU farms are run by farmers under the age of 35 in comparison to over 65. So you can see there's a huge imbalance there. This is the age profile of Irish farmers over a period of time, and the next census coming up will show an updated figure, but the brown in 65 and over. So, you know, that's the dominant number, and the blue, of course, is less than 35. So stark difference. And even around the country, I suppose this is a map of Ireland here. You can see on the west coast, the farms are more peripheral, smaller. The landscape is more challenging. So yeah, I suppose you don't have as many younger farmers as down in the south in Cork, where that's where the real dairy industry is. And I suppose they can make a full-time occupation in farming. So yeah. So when we talk about this farm transfer, obviously, it's probably desirable for the younger generation to get involved, but the older generation's reluctance to step aside and retire is globally recognized. And this is despite an array of financial enticements encouraging the process. I suppose when I started this research in 2013, if I had to base on why I did what I did, this would be it. This was the previous retirement policy scheme for farmers in 2007. And the terms and conditions were outrageous, offensive, just oblivious to the farming culture and mindset. This is word for word what was included within this policy document. For a supposedly agricultural nation, for them not to understand this was quite bizarre, the Department of Agriculture. But yeah, persons intending to retire into the scheme shall cease agricultural activity forever. Word for word, continued participation in farming is not permitted and be between 55 and 66, which is young for farming. So yeah, they were essentially being asked to revise their self-perceptions, oblivious to the mindset and older farmers. So, you know, huge need to look beyond financial enticements alone to understand this. So this research challenged this approach. This PhD research at the time delved deeper into the mindset and mannerisms to identify the various human dynamics, i.e. social and emotional issues affecting this farm succession and retirement policy and in later life. And, you know, over the course of the research, there were six publications all dealing with the human dynamics from a different standpoint, but it all came together, I suppose, to inform the research I'm doing now. But yeah, it kind of told a story through the years. Every year since 2016, there's been a paper published on the research. And I suppose it's to pay some gratitude to the late Dr. Packy Commons, who did look into certain aspects of this attitudes and behavior patterns back in the 1970s. And I suppose when you think about the early retirement scheme, which I spoke about a while ago in 2007, for them to disregard his research, 40 years later, almost 40 years later, I just felt it was very important to really tackle into this and make sure it was never forgotten about, I suppose. I won't go into the research methods too much, just to show you the scale of the research, almost 900 farmers involved. And interestingly, those national farm surveys represented about 80,000 farmers. So it was a huge sample, nationally representative across the country, across farming systems, across farming scales. So yeah, it does give a good picture. Initially, there was a transferring the family farm clinics run by our National Food and Farm Advisory Body, Teagasc, and I attended all those around the country, a self-administered questionnaire. I suppose it was interesting that 60% of the 450-ish people who completed it supplied their contact details. And again, that's where my positionality came in strongly, because they knew I was farmer's son. I suppose they trusted that the research was for them, of benefit to them. And when I ran a sample, you can see that the interviews were carried out across the country as well. So, there was strength in that approach. Quick overview of the findings. It did confirm that the human side was being overlooked. This huge disconnect between farm transfer policy and the mindset of the targeted population. It was so clear that farming is more than an economic activity. And if it was about economics alone, there'd be probably very few doing it. It's a way of life. Big part of the findings and really strong evidence that there's a cultural expectation within the farming community that farmers just don't retire. And indeed, those who do are seen to have defeatist attitude almost, and those who don't are revered. Those who die with their boots on are, admired by their peers. And I suppose that mindset in the farming community is so strong that I suppose it's a generational thing almost. And farmers wish to remain active and productive. Even as their physical capabilities diminish, they want to be active and to, be involved in some way, because it contributes to their mental health and well-being. So just a few quotes. I won't go into them all, just highlighted little bits, but this is a 72-year-old farmer in the southeast. I asked him, had he ever considered farming? He said, never. And then he proceeded to tell me how hard he worked. And I don't know, do I believe him or not, that he was up at 6:30 and going till 10 or 11 at night. Probably wasn't, but he wanted me to think he was, because, that's the pride attached to the hardworking farmer. And then without even cracking a smile, he said, I'm only 72 so definitely not for a few more years. And you can kind of just see that's the narrative. Another farmer from the West basically said that cutting farmers adrift from their farm at that stage of their life would leave them in a very lonely place. When I asked them about previous policy asking them to, cease agricultural activity forever, that was the response. Even mentioned that it would create depression amongst farmers to cut them adrift. Another interesting finding, that as well as an attachment and a pride attached to their occupation, of course, and this is the same in the US, there's a huge relationship between the farmer and the actual farm. Be it the land or even the buildings, the animals. And, looking at this concept of insideness, I actually took this from research in Appalachia in Kentucky, just talking about connectedness and sense of place in later life. So, there's the physical insideness, of course, be it, as I said, the land or the animals, the farmyard, how it developed over the years, the social insideness, which is their circle of friends and farming peers, and autobiographical insideness, that this farm was in a family for a certain amount of generations, and there's a story attached to it, and they're a spoke in the family wheel. That was the kind of message that was coming through, sense of nostalgia, essentially. Again, an example of a quote. I'm sure even wherever you are in the US or elsewhere, I'm sure these quotes will resonate in some way, because farmers have a common sort of an understanding, and they have a common love of the land, and so it's a way of life. Your occupation is so entwined with your home life, and it's at the doorstep, I suppose. So that's what makes it unique. And even this farmer talking about if he went on holidays for a few days with his wife, that he'd be anxious to get back to the farm. He'd be really missing it, way out of the depth anywhere else. This another farmer, 85 years of age. Very interesting to hear this at that stage of their life. And he had transferred the farm to his daughter and son. Sorry, it was in a partnership. And I suppose it kind of shows that even upon transferring the farm, that being involved in the farm and being productive and knowing what's going on was so important to him. Talking the same talk with other dairy farmers, to hate to be out of the loop. So that's why to stay in touch and continue dairying. It makes sense, because if he was to retire and step aside, all he's ever known is this talk about milk yields, butterfat, protein. But yet, if he's disconnected, where does that leave him? And that's where it contributes to the mental health and well-being. So this challenge of transition to becoming a retired farmer, or to retire, is overwhelming. And I get complimented by certain people that I've looked into the soft issues. It's great you've looked into the soft issues, but these psychodynamic and sociodynamic factors are the most difficult to deal with. These can't be solved by financial enticements. So, ironically, they really are the hard issues. No one can avoid aging. Doesn't matter who you are, what you are. And as my research has identified, most older farmers opt to remain actively engaged in farming in later life instead of retiring. That's just the common theme, the common research findings that came through. So that means that the most sophisticated of farm transfer plans are of little avail if these policymakers and practitioners aren't prepared and competent enough to understand this language of farming, this mindset and mannerisms. So I suppose when you look at this, where does this lead you? The development of interventions, strategies addressing this emotional and social well-being has the potential to greatly ease the stresses of this process, to look a little bit deeper into this and say, okay, we have to acknowledge that this isn't just about a lump sum, please retire into the sun. There needs to be a more nuanced insight, and it needs to be dealt with a lot more sensitively, because this stigma, defeatist stereotype, it needs to be, help remove it in some way, and to promote a more willful and positive attitude towards the younger generation having more involvement. You have to portray a sense of purposeness rather than one of cessation to the older farmer, that they're important to the farm. They're not just going to stop. So, when they talk about early retirement scheme, I suggested, well, if it was called farm progression scheme, that would mean that the older generation see that by stepping aside somewhat, by giving their advice in an advisory role, that the farm will progress. So rather than this early retirement scheme, the language associated with that is not applicable in farming context. And I suppose this is very important, and I want to get this message out there. So of course, when you publish, when you work in the university and you publish in an academic journal, it's well received and everyone's happy with it, and self-fulfillment and that kind of thing. But if you really want to make a difference at a societal level, you have to be able to communicate this message down through the different tiers. So, you know, a research magazine will synopsize the academic-y paper, which is very theory heavy, and, you know, it can be heavy going if you're not just not familiar with it. So once it's picked up and synopsized by research magazines or farm advisory magazines, that's when the media pick it up. And that's probably the most important of all, because that means that the farmers themselves are reading it. They can see how research is making an impact. And that's at a national level. And even more rewarding is if it gets into a local media, in that a paper within a community and farmers understanding this message and looking at this and going, you know, I can make sense of this. I can see the benefits, but I can also see that we're being acknowledged as an older generation. And, you know, that's something that we've always tried to really emphasize, the Rural Studies Centre at NUI Galway. That's a real emphasis we have, and hopefully that can be rolled out elsewhere. You know, you have to remove this silo mentality. You know, policy, research and practice need to work together in a multi-actor approach rather than working individually. And I suppose when I look at this and where this has led, one of the most rewarding outcomes of the PhD was a recent report by the Commission, who acknowledged the research and criticised the appropriateness of farmer retirement schemes in Ireland. And this is a report by Brussels in Belgium, and, you know, this is the top tier of agricultural policy in Europe. And they called for an increased focus on mechanisms that help the older farmer enhance their quality of life by exploring possibilities under social policy. They didn't look for increased focus on mechanisms that help older farmers retire. Just to note that, it was to enhance their quality of life under social policy. So I suppose that was like, reading that gave me inspiration for the next steps. So I could see that, okay, it's finally been acknowledged that there's more to this in economics. But what are these social policy measures? They don't really exist. The report was left at that. So, you know, the next steps, and this has been going on over the past few months, is looking at literature from elsewhere and looking at this age-friendly environment concept. And this has recently been published, but, you know, to just bring it back a step, you know, to set the scene, you know, this prospect of surrendering professional and personal identity upon transferring the farm and retiring, as advised by previous policy at European level, is a concept that older farmers find difficult to accept. And no one can avoid aging, as I said. And, you know, it needs to look into the welfare of older farmers, adapt to their requirements. So I looked at the World Health Organization. They've published a lot of reports on aging, healthy aging. And, you know, it was just interesting to read it, because I was looking for social policy, and I was kind of right there in front of my eyes when I looked at this, because they were talking about active aging, opportunities to enhance quality of life as people age. And the word active is not just about physically, but it's continued participation in social, cultural, civic affairs. So yeah, I'm sure that you can see how this is a lead on, and it resonates with what I spoke about earlier. And this is actual policy by the World Health Organization. They want to, you know, remove these barriers to this ageist society, I suppose, that we probably live in. There's inadequate policies. So yeah, and a big part of it, lack of consultation and involvement of the older generation as to what they want to have in later life. And yeah, that policy again epitomizes everything that was wrong with farm succession and retirement measures put in place. And you know, even with the World Health Organization, some thought-provoking points as you read through it. And you know, it's not applicable to everyone, but it's true in some cases that it's biological aging is only loosely associated with the person's age in years. some farmers, some people in general might have the physical and mental capabilities similar to a 20-year-old. I know that's not in all cases, but you have to think about farmers. Some of them are very tough and they will work very hard at that age of their life. So, and this isn't in a farming context, this is just a kind of a blanket kind of a point that they've made. And also the World Health Organization have acknowledged that older people can make positive contributions to society, and that expenditure in their health and social care is an investment rather than a cost, and they can bring benefits to society. So I suppose a shift in focus, treat older people as assets rather than burdens. Again, this is all setting the scene. This isn't my points, but I'm just trying to show you how this research has evolved. This was the literature that backed it up. So yeah. So when you look at a farming context, the older generation hold an invaluable store of locally specific knowledge, lay knowledge developed over years of interaction and experience working on a farm. And the reality is that the younger generation have not yet accumulated this. And as this, what's referred to as soil-specific human capital, is not easily communicated or transferred, upon an hour of a lecture, for example, there needs to be continued advice and guidance of the older generation. I suppose when I again talk to students, or you explain it in a way that John or Mary, I'll just give an example, go to University College Dublin, where our ag school is in Ireland. They study animal and crop production. They're top of their class. They get on so well. And then it's time to go home to farm at a different, so the Lyons Estate is the name of the farm in University College Dublin, top of the range, has the best of everything, and that's where the students learn. But John or Mary goes back to their farm at home and try to apply what they learned basically from the books, if we want to simplify it, on their land at home. And the older generation, father or mother, just says, no, hold on a second. This field will do this at this time of the year. We can't do this over here now. So without the older generation, without that knowledge, it's lost. So that's why it's important. And retirement can create critical shortages of these experienced personnel. And this can have a negative effect on farm performance. So on one hand, you could argue that all the old generation are getting in the way, essentially, or they don't have the digital skill set, but yet they have this mind, this brain that's full of expertise and knowledge and skills. Like in Ireland at the moment, we're having a huge crisis, as elsewhere, with fertilizer costs. Huge issues that we can't get urea from, I suppose a lot of it comes from, unfortunately, Russia and all that's going on there. It's horrific, but because of that, it's becoming so expensive and out of reach for a lot of farmers. But you only have to look back to the previous generation and the generation before. They didn't have all that. They were able to manage their land without that. So that knowledge is more important than ever, to be able to manage the soil, to grow, cover crops, catch crops. It's all needed now, because this could go on for God knows how long, and that this knowledge is so important. It's just to put it into context. So yeah, instead of reporting that farm management decisions are in the hands of a generation who are more resistant to change and growth, policymakers must embrace and publicly promote and recognize the older generation's skill and knowledge. Yeah, it's important, and that will contribute to the mental health and well-being, to show that they feel needed. So, the World Health Organization age-friendly environments concept, which I alluded to earlier, this has gathered momentum since they launched its global age-friendly cities and community project in 2006. And the way they define it is that age-friendly environment is one that policies, services, settings, and structures support and enable people to age actively. And that's what farmers want to do, age actively. So it's worth exploring how this could be incorporated in a farming context. So it just talks about social environments. again, I suppose predominantly urban, but you can see how it can translate to a farming context, and helps combat ageism, which, if you were to look at agri-policy at EU level and previously in Ireland, they were ageist. There's no doubt about it. They were very harsh on the older generation and disregarded them. And there's been reports published about this concept. And again, it's more than likely very applicable in the US context as well. But yeah, just wanted to show you that that literature is out there if you're interested in reading it. And again, there's interactive databases about the age-friendly cities and communities. But I suppose when I was reading this and seeing how it can be applied in a farming or rural context, it's predominantly focused on an urban aging model. And because of that, it fails to reflect the diversity of rural areas, particularly the farming community. Like, it's all well and good looking at age-friendly environments, but if you're not, if you're looking at predominantly urban, it's not representative. And because it's such an important policy and it really does hit home that there needs to be more acknowledgement for the older generation, and you can't just have it for urban dwellers. So again, setting the scene as to where this research is going. Because agricultural policy has been preoccupied, obsessed almost with encouraging older farmers to step aside and retire, appears to be at odds with the basic principles of the age-friendly environment approach, which I talked about. So on one hand, you have a huge, massive, worldwide global organization, the World Health Organization, advocating for the older generation, but yet at national and policy level in farming, it's been disregarded. So it's about getting the balance right. Like, I'm not naive to think that the older generation, in some cases, there needs to be generational renewal, but also there needs to be acknowledgement of what they can offer. So this is where the research has led to the creation of an age-friendly environment in farming. And I'll kind of show you how I have worked this into a farming context. So looking at the potential of this, and with a particular focus on the well-being benefits of being a member of a social group in later life, and thinking back to what the Commissioner talking about, European Commission, in one of the slides about it needs to look into social policy to try and address their well-being. This is an example of what it can be. And I've quoted the World Health Organization already. Because they do advocate for social group membership in later life, meaningful activities that are brought upon by doing so can help enhance one's quality of life. And meaningful activities in farming would be continued farming. So it's about how do we incorporate that into a social group in later life. It can bring about social inclusion, health and well-being. And this is well documented in social gerontology research, the study of older people. And the paper that I wrote, this paper here, draws on family farm, succession and retirement literature, and social gerontology and the World Health Organization to, I suppose, reevaluate how we engage and understand the older farmer's perspective, see what we can do about this to create this age-friendly environment in farming. Yeah, I received funding from the Galway Illuminate program. It's an innovation office to look into this and see what was possible a few months ago. And again, just as before, of course, it's great in an academic journal, but through my collaboration with Anne Kinsella and Chagas, who's a senior economist with their National Farm Advisory Body, we were able to get a synopsis of this research into an agri magazine. And this is really important because this is more accessible and it's free. People don't have to pay to access this, but yet the message comes across. And yeah, you can see just how it's synopsized, and I place a lot of importance on that. This is the take we have on it, I have on it, to establish a social organization that represents the specific needs and interests of the older farmers in later life, because this will provide them with a sense of purpose and connectedness within the farming community, be it peer-to-peer collegiality. Even if a farmer is not married, for example, they'll have a connection with the local their local club or their local peer group of social organization. And it will have activities suited to their own needs and interests, specifically to their needs and interests. And I suppose one way to look at it, it's not the only way to look at it, but it could, if successfully rolled out, ease concerns around the fear of the unknown upon stepping aside in retirement. Because there is that fear of the unknown. What happens next? And if they had the comfort of knowing that there was a social organization for farmers in later life, you know, they might get some comfort in that. Yeah, so that's really the point I made, that their social connectedness, their legitimate connectedness, the way they can talk to other farmers will not be jeopardized if they hand over the farm to the next generation. If they know that there's a peer group of older farmers in their locality that are in the same situation, and they have various activities tailored to their needs. And I suppose you only have to look at the COVID-19 pandemic to realize the importance of this social inclusion. These social isolation efforts were detrimental in a lot of cases. And the United Nations even have highlighted these support networks such as retirement groups, but we won't call them retirement groups in farming. You know, a social group in later life play a valuable and beneficial role in helping to secure older people's well-being during difficult times. So there wasn't any in existence in Ireland during the pandemic. I know that there would have been issues with them coming together anyways, but they would have had some sort of a connection all the same. So I suppose when you're rolling this out, this is all well and good in theory. The idea might be nice, it might be a nice idea, but how can it actually happen? And I think from the research and from reading research from the United Kingdom, there's huge potential on collaborating with the livestock mart sector in relation to this. And even if it is a tillage farmer, for example, growing crops, you know, in a lot of cases, a lot of towns across the country will have a livestock mart in the locality. It's not just a venue of transaction. Of course, they go to sell and buy their animals, but it's also a hive of social interaction. A lot of farmers go to the mart on a Saturday or a Wednesday evening near where I'm from for the chats, for a look. That's the expressions that's used, just to catch up with their peers. So this hive of social interaction is going on here, not just selling animals. A vital social facility in Ireland anyways, and I'm sure some of you, in be it whatever state you're from, the US, can resonate with this. And some have no other social outlet. This is their day out in a lot of cases. And they rely on this weekly visit to the mart to meet friends, to exchange ideas, and to catch up on local news. Even if it's a bit of gossip, it still gives them connectedness. And in Ireland, this has really grown in significance over the years. You know, there's been a clamp down on drink driving and rural pubs, and that had been going on, but now it's very strict, and farmers don't have that outlet, I suppose. Closure of post offices where they'd accumulate as well, local shops. So this mart is a really focal point in a lot of rural communities. And I suppose I'm just trying to set the scene as to their potential. And around Ireland, just for example, there's 60 cooperative marts across the Irish countryside. And they're almost like a mecca for farmers in a lot of cases. They come there. A lot of older farmers, a lot of old bachelor farmers head there as well. So you can see how there's an almost a ready-made platform and network to host this organization. So it would be about collaborating with the livestock marts to diversify their services. You know, at the moment they're selling livestock, and they'd have a canteen, for example, to feed the farmers during the day. But if they were to expand their services to host a social hub for older farmers, even if to start off it's for an hour after the mart to come together to discuss things, you know, you could walk around the mart. They could have a group walking around looking at the cattle, guess the weight, guess the price. But again, like, these are all very simple things, but the older generation would really enjoy this. And there'd be a degree of competitiveness as well, you know, that who can guess, you know, this is all just hypothetical, but I'm sure some of you can relate to what I'm talking about here. Because they do come here. This is an outlet, a social outlet in a lot of cases. So if this social organization can be incorporated, like the name I've given it is Farmers Yards. I'm not sure, there's an organization called Men's Sheds. It's originated in Australia, but it's really a big movement now across Europe and the world. It's for men who have retired, and they come together to do some sort of crafts, or they work with their hands, they make things. But, you know, farmers are quite territorial, a little bit, you know, they are who they are. They're a farmer. They're no one else. No one else understands farmers. So I suppose they don't really participate in these men's sheds organizations in a lot of cases. And the men's sheds is too gender specific. It doesn't include women. And I know through my own research, talking to older women whose husbands had passed away, the love and desire to continue farming was profound with those. I asked a woman in her 70s, what does the farm mean to you? And she said, let me put it like this. My husband died last year. And she said, we got married 40 years prior. And she said, when you asked me what's the farm mean to me, she said, I can associate and relate the development of the farm through those 40 years with the marriage of my husband and the kids and different stages of the farm. So she said, that's what it means to me. And, you know, she got quite emotional, and, you know, it's difficult enough to listen to that, you know, but it just kind of showed me how important this research was. And that's why I was very keen that it's applicable to men and women. So this whole Farmers Yards, like a farm yard, but this would be the name, and hopefully it can be rolled out. I think it's applicable across the world, that wording. So hopefully it can happen. And I think the knock-on effect of this, you know, hypothetically speaking, there was a group set up for older farmers. It could address a spin-off by addressing health and safety, because farming is one of the most hazardous occupations, disproportionately high fatality rates when compared to other sectors. Farmers really have a lot of satisfaction and well-being with their daily and seasonal labor-intensive demands of working the farm. That's part of their psyche. But at what cost? At that stage of their life, if they want to continue, are they taking risks? The HSA in Ireland is the Health and Safety Authority. Perhaps if there was a social group for older farmers, they would have access to them. At the moment, there's nothing there to get access to these people. So potentially this could help address this by holding a workshop someday about different tasks. And potentially health and safety training can become an activity that a peer group of farmers can do together rather than a task, because at the moment it's interpreted as a task that they have to do. And, you know, this is just a statistic. In 2019, 66% of farm deaths were farmers over 60. So the knock-on effect of a social group of farmers, an organization, could potentially address things like this as well as digitization, digital skills. You know, there's scope for a lot of things. So, you know, this isn't just an Irish issue, a European issue. It's a global issue. And I think, you know, even the statistic that a third of US farmers are over 65, you know, you can relate to that there as well. So this begins this broader international conversation about the place, views, concerns, needs of older farmers. Thankfully, different universities in the US have been very responsive to this research. They've featured it on their websites. It's been fantastic and encouraging in that sense that what I'm doing in Ireland is applicable there. So it gives you a kind of a motivation to keep going with this. And this is where this has led. involved in the International Farm Transfers Survey, initially with John Baker from Iowa State University. Brilliant man, but so much time from me. He was so good to me in my time over in the US. And being involved in that, I got, communicating with him and getting to know him. I got involved in this farm transfer survey with Professor Matt Lobley in the UK. They were the co-directors. And, over the course of the PhD, I did gather research data, but I didn't have a data set to compare it with. But thankfully, in 2019, it was carried out in Iowa, and the same questions are asked. So it's a common collaborative effort across the world to compare patterns, processes, speed of succession retirement, and this will give a firm base for future inquiries. So you can see this is where it's being carried out across the world. Over 17,000 farmers have completed it. I suppose, like, when you're doing research, it has to be as up to date as possible. So in Ireland in 2014, there probably wasn't much point comparing it with the English in 1997 because it had dated. But that's what was so great about when Iowa, when I got the data set from John Baker, that I was able to compare relatively new data with each other. So it would be, up to date. And just for your own interest, these are the states in the US that it has been carried out as well. Yeah, it's been around for quite a few years, but it's great to be involved with it. So I wanted to compare Ireland and Iowa to identify, rates and patterns of succession, across cultures, farming operations, typologies, geographical locations, and scale. And the scale is a big one, because you only need to look at this. The average farm size in Ireland is 80 acres. In Iowa, it's 359. Huge difference. So you'd imagine there would be a lot of differences. But this is where it gets interesting. When you compare Ireland with Iowa, there's such a close similarities with the data. Semi-retirement is a concept that farmers, predominantly, I suppose, thought about. But even at that, there was a third, you could say, that really didn't want, a quarter, about that didn't want to retire at all. And then some of them indicated that they would, which is fair enough. That's representative in that sense. But I just wanted to point out one thing about the semi-retirement. It's very easy to tick a box and say semi-retirement, but my research really delved deeper into this concept of semi-retirement. And there was a paper written in 1996. It was called the Prince Charles syndrome. So you think of Prince Charles' situation. He is still second in command. He is still essentially the child. He is not the king. His mother is still in command. In farming, in a lot of cases, it could be that. A farmer could be in their 50s and then their 80-year-old father or mother are still the ones making the decisions. And that can become quite draining, I suppose, and your sense of purpose is a little bit challenged. And I think the younger generation, are we prepared to put up with that? And that's the danger about the lack of succession. So when you look at it again, is William next? What age is he going to be when he's in control or he's the boss? And I suppose for farmers, it could be that. So it's just a way of looking at semi-retirement is a tricky one in a farming context, because do they actually intend to retire, or is it just, in theory? So interestingly enough as well, there's a lot of talk about there's a lack of successors, but from this research, there's quite a significant amount of farmers who have a successor identified. 52% in Ireland and 40% in Iowa. But do they have a succession plan to facilitate all this, to facilitate this semi-retirement, this succession, this people, children, nephews, nieces waiting in the shadows, I suppose. 77% of respondents in Ireland didn't, and 66% in Iowa don't. So a huge percentage. And I suppose that's where this International Farm Transition Network training, the upcoming conference in June, will really try and address this and delve into this. because that's a huge significant number of farmers that don't. And what happens if the older generation pass away and there's no succession plan? It's a very tricky one. It's can be detrimental for families. So that's just an important point to make. To address this, and this has been in a previous publication, at the moment, succession planning is a taboo in a lot of families to talk about. But hypothetically speaking, if succession planning module, this is an Irish context, perhaps some of the universities in the USA have this already in place, but if it was to become part of the agricultural curriculum, it would just become known as the done thing to do. So if you're doing a module on some sort of an agricultural module, that part of the criteria to get this module or to pass it is that you have to draw up a succession plan with your father or mother at home in relation to the farm. So if it was brought in an educational side rather than, I suppose, brought in at an earlier stage, sensitively brought in, it would hopefully in some cases remove the taboo, and the conversation has already been opened at an earlier stage. So what we're trying to do is normalize succession planning within the farming community, because at the moment it is this sort of a topic that's difficult to talk about. And this would in turn replace what is currently unthinkable within many farm households, that they would actually talk about the future, what happens next. And tackling it through this, it's going to take a while, but it could set in motion this long-term perception acceptance that, talking about the future of the farm is the right thing to do. And it is the right thing to do, but how do we make it the right thing to do, or how do we try and frame it in that sense? And I suppose the farm succession coordinators sitting here, that's something to think about. But I'm in no ways oblivious to how complex and in a lot of cases how finance and economics drive this process. So the ideas presented here are not a one-size-fits-all model for fixing this farm succession situation or problem, but addressing the human side of this process is essential moving forward. In order for it to actually mobilize or to be successful, the older generation's social and emotional well-being, their mental health and well-being needs to be taken into account, because this is their way of life. This is all they've ever known. And the concept of retirement is so alien to them, so terrifying, that without addressing that, it'll be of little avail, all these strategies drawn up by various government departments. So yeah, policy should be more concerned with the mental health and welfare of older farmers and adapt to their needs. And hopefully the research can inform future policy directions to understand the world as farmers perceive it. That's essentially all I want to get across, that policymakers understand what's going on at farm level within the farming mindset. And as a consequence, prevent farmers from being isolated and excluded from society. Policy doesn't want, it's by accident this is happening. They're not intending for farmers to be isolated in later life, but by not understanding what's going on at farm level, it's what's happening. And to give these older farmers a voice, because they haven't been represented, and thankfully over the past few years they have been. I put this slide up a lot at the end, and some of you may have seen this clip, but it's called Looms. It's a very short film, maybe 15 minutes, but it's brilliant. I find it's set in the US, a short film about an American farmer who struggles to find purpose in his life, to let go or remain rooted. I think if you watch this after my presentation, everything that I've talked about will resonate, and it'll really sink in. Very good. I would recommend that. Suppose I just wanted to plug our own Rural Studies Centre at NUI Galway. We do have an online webinar held at the last Wednesday of every month that you can tune into. Sometimes it will apply more to rural society issues rather than farming, but there'll be a mix of both. So I suppose it's just to keep an eye out on the NUI Galway Rural Studies Centre Twitter page, so you can keep track of what's coming up. But yeah, we try and have expertise in different areas. So overall, thanks for your attention. This is a famous movie, I suppose, from Ireland. That's Richard Harris there. It's called The Field. And even back in 1965, the language within this movie is so applicable today as it was then. You know, talking about, it was all about this field. And ironically, it was actually an American who was supposed to be coming over and trying to buy this field off this farmer. And it caused a lot of controversy in this rural community anyways. And but basically this love of the land and how we dug the rocks out of it and made it a living thing, and that lovely green grass, and to take away from me the sight of God, I can't let you do that. And he became obsessed with this field, but you know, and watched this farm field for 40 years and the father before me for 40 years. But again, it kind of, even back then, it encapsulated a lot of what's going on now. So it's quite ironic, really, that this amount of time later that there's still these issues. So thanks for your attention. That's I'm sorry for, well, it's almost an hour, so I hope I didn't keep ranting on for too long. But that's the story of 9 years of research.
Okay, thanks, Shane. I think that was great information on 9 years of research and work and effort that you've been putting into this project. So I have posted into the chat box the SurveyMonkey link for those that are certified farm transition coordinators to get your CEU. So please make sure you click that before you log off today and answer the questions there. If you are not currently a certified farm transition coordinator, we do have a session coming up along with our annual conference, and that will be coming up June 6th or June 8th and 9th is our annual meeting, and the Monday, Tuesday before that is a certified coordinator training, but there'll be a couple virtual sessions before those two actual in-person dates. So if you're interested, please jump over to our IFTN webpage and watch your emails as well, so that you get the information you need to, 1, participate in our annual conference, and 2, become a certified farm transition coordinator if you are so inclined for that. So any questions? And I'll be quiet for a second.